really want to thank you all for joining us here at Eastern State. My name is Lauren. I'm the Senior Director of Learning and Engagement, and I'm honored to be moderating our opening panel for this weekend's events. If you didn't know, May is National Historic Preservation Month, and this Memorial Day weekend, we're inviting the public to explore Eastern State, America's first penitentiary, as a place of remembrance, bearing witness to the complex and deeply human stories that shaped its history and continue to shape our present as a museum and historic site. Welcome. Feel free to come sit with us and chat with us. Today's panel is called a Memorial to Preserve. This is an annual conversation with early site advocates who rescued this building from decay and transformed it. Joining me today are Sally Elk and Ken Finkel. Thank you so much for being here. And I do want to say there is a treasure trove of images in this slide deck. A lot of them are Ken's, and I have not seen a lot of these images before. I think we'll be referring to them as we talk, but I really want to encourage you to listen, to look, and we will have time for questions today. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with Eastern State? And Sally, I'm going to have you start.
Okay, so I was an employee of the Philadelphia Historical Commission, which is the City of Philadelphia's historic preservation agency. The City of Philadelphia owns Eastern State. So while I was working there, there was a movement to sell this property to real estate developers. And I'd never been in before, so I didn't have much of an opinion at the time. But once I came in, I was hooked for quite a while.
And me, how did I get involved? I was a curator of prints and photographs, graphics at the Library Company of Philadelphia Historic Collection. And I had done one book with Dover Publications, 19th Century Photographs, and I proposed the second book, Philadelphia Then and Now, which they eventually published. So happens right in the midst of when this project was up in the air as to whether it would be partially demolished, sold, whatever. And so for a spread in that, a two-page spread in that book, Philadelphia Then and Now, was Cell Block 1 in 1872 and then 1987. And around that time, I knew Sally, and I wrote an op-ed piece which for the Inquirer, which I had been doing on a regular basis about history and culture and preservation. And it was published, actually, the first one of two that I wrote was published 38 years ago today, by absolute coincidence.
Wow. So this question's also for both of you. Sally, you said you walked in here and you were hooked. What were your first impressions of Eastern State beyond being hooked? And because I've known you for so long, you say that buildings talk to you. What did Eastern State say?
Help! So to preface this a little bit, there was a historic preservation architect on the Historical Commission. So the Historical Commission is governed by a commission. And he said at a meeting when so Eastern State is a National Historic Landmark, and it's also on the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places. Was put on the register in 1958, really early, and a National Historic Landmark in 1965. So in the discussions at the Historical Commission meetings, David said at one point it was the most amazing building he'd ever seen. And he was a world traveler, and that resonated with me. I'd better go see this place. So when I came in, you've started to see some of the vegetation that was growing all over the place. It was like an urban forest. There was a colony of cats. In fact, I remember a mother cat nursing her kittens on the step of Cell Block 1. It was quite an incredible place. But then to come inside and to come in the center where you can see down every one of the original cell blocks was just stunning to me. But also, I grew up in Iowa, and there were no buildings in Iowa like this. So that's what brought the amazement to me. But then over time, as I learned the significance, I was even more hooked.
So, excuse me having to read my notes, but there's a bunch of adjectives here. Vast.
Can you hold the mic out, Ken?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Vast, authentic, problematic, formidable, and fun in the most daunting possible way. It was, and what Sally said about seeing it for the first time, you get hooked, especially when its future and its fate were up in the air. And so that was the fun part. I mean, this became, and I'm not sure this comment will land quite right, this was our clubhouse. We had a club.
We did.
Called Eastern State Penitentiary Task Force.
We did.
And who
And-
else was in the
and-
task force with you guys?
And no one appointed us.
No, we were all volunteers.
Okay.
So there were representatives from the neighborhoods. There was a representative from the Pennsylvania Prison Society. There was a representative from the Foundation for Architecture, Library Company,
Preservation Coalition.
Preservation Coalition, Park Service. Who am I forgetting?
And
The
many
architects.
of the different neighborhoods,
Right.
which were probably more different then. I mean, depending in which direction you were headed. And by the way, I lived with my wife, Margaret, and eventually our kids on North Street, then Aspen Street. So I lived in two adjacent neighborhoods before leaving for Mount Airy, but I'm back.
But one of the things about the task force that was so compelling was that all of us had jobs. None of us had any power anywhere in our jobs. So when we got together, I think we felt powerful somehow because we were driven to figure out a way to save the building. And all these people brought their special qualifications that they had in their own work to this group of people.
So the task force met at the library company as a gesture to support the effort, and the minutes were taken, and this is all before electronic communications, and Xeroxed and mailed out using old-fashioned snail mail to all the members of the task force, and then some. So over a few years, we really created the impression that we were something, when in fact we still were nothing.
And what year was, what decade was this? What year was this? What time period?
80, I wish I could remember
88.
exactly when, 87, 88?
88. The first meeting was in June of 88.
Okay.
The city said no to the, no, I'm sorry. I think I'm wrong about that. No, those were the first of the minutes.
So there was this occasion when you said, Ken, if you're going to write another op-ed piece, now's the time, and that was May of 88. You said now it really matters now. Before it was a discussion, but here all of a sudden there was a lot at stake. And the meeting with the mayor, you remember how that came about?
Well, yes, but that was I didn't go to that. I wasn't allowed to go to that.
Right. I believe the reporting, and I have some slides of headlines. April 30th, 88 was when the mayor's response to that meeting was, and his decision to not allow the redevelopment authority to recall it and to preserve it. There had been a movement in our discussions to advocate for preservation, but so many people said, it's just too big, you can't preserve it. And no one in that time imagined that it would be anything like what we see today. It just was beyond comprehension.
And people would say, even though Alcatraz had been open at the time and was attracting 300,000 people a year, people would say, well, Philadelphia's not San Francisco. There's no water to cross. You want to build a moat around the prison so you can cross water to? Who's going to come and see a historic prison? Who would be interested in doing that?
So, just like following that thread, Ken, what made you believe that Eastern State was worth saving, even in its condition and given its painful history as well?
Well, actually, it's all those things I said before about what attracted me. Its vastness, its uniqueness, its authenticity. I mean, when you were here, it's still very much the case, but when you were the only people, 2, 3 people walking around the site, you know, it was special and it was unique and it felt that. I mean, I would stand outside and just get the vibe of the building, and we had never experienced anything quite like this, and historic landmarks tended to be celebratory. This was definitely not a celebration, and yet, you know, what was it? And the problematic way of seeing history had not yet taken hold. There were a lot of people who said, you know, if you can't make the story positive, don't do it. And I have a letter from John Moss, who in 1973, he was a city employee and an author of a book called The Glorious Enterprise. That was his idea of what you preserve. It was about the centennial and the buildings of the centennial. After reading one of my op-ed pieces, he wrote, "Dear Mr. Finkel," and he introduces himself, and then he says, "Your loathsome piece about Eastern State Penn is perverse, criminal, immoral, and obscene." Of course, I knew we were on the right track. And then he says a bit more, which would make most people want to run away. As a monument of man's inhumanity to man, Eastern State Penn ranks with Auschwitz. This monstrous building must be razed. This was a preservationist.
So, what kept you both going? What did you think this place had the power to become?
I think the thing that kept us going was, first of all, we met monthly, and we had an agenda, and we had committees, so people had to report out. But secondly, we were successful in getting some early foundation support and city support to do some studies. So the first one we did was called the Building Condition Assessment Study, and that one, there was a team of architects that went throughout every single room, every single space in this building, took a photograph, and then assessed its condition and its safety. So that came back that the buildings were sound, and so that made us feel really good. Then we went on with a condition assessment report, a stabilization report that talked about how to protect the buildings from deteriorating further. But I think the most important study that happened was the historic structures study. And you were part of the team that put together the request for proposals to do this, but one of the things that was brilliant about that study was that it looked at the history of the buildings, the history of the whatever we could find out about prisoner relationships, any correspondence from prisoners, but the way the prison was operated over the years and why certain buildings were built. So it gave us a more complete history of how the place operated. And I think that's what led to viewing the place not as just architecture. It was more than that.
Yeah. So the historic structures report, I can't remember exactly what it cost, but tens of thousands of dollars. That money was not being made available through anywhere or the city. And so how to find that money, without which that report would not enable any work to be done. It would be the absolute wrong thing to embark on a major preservation project not without a plan, without understanding fully what you're dealing with. So there were a number of things that we wanted, all of which cost more than anyone could imagine we could ever find. And we still were the task force. We had no authority and no budget and no leadership and no board of directors. We were the board of directors of this ad hoc group. So I remember a meeting with Pew, with Ella King-Torrey from Pew. We were sitting around the table, and sometimes when you're in a major foundation in their space, there's sort of magic in the air. You think if only they fund this, it could make a major difference. And so Ella said, well, what do you want to do? And we ticked off all the things: an exhibition at the Art Museum, a historic structures report, a film, whatever. There were
An oral history project.
Oral history project. There were many facets, and she said, and so what do you think you need to make all this happen? And someone, we hadn't prepared that number, and someone said $250,000, and Ella said, how about 400?
Wow.
I remember that.
And
we were like, yeah.
and that was when the air quality changed, and she said, and we need the proposal in 3 weeks. And we said, okay, not having a clue as to how we would accomplish
The
that.
40-page proposal, 40 pages.
But we did. We got it done, and the money came in.
I've never heard that story before. That's incredible.
She stopped doing that after a while because...
She stopped
you know,
doing it.
Well, Pew did.
Pew did.
because too many people were coming to them for these one-on-one conversations, so then they made a very formal
Sure.
way of applying.
Go ahead, Ken.
So there was a moment, that was a key moment. There was another moment with Wilson Good, the mayor, in his office, and it's really important to put that on the table here. He was not at all in favor of, he was not interested in this place. And Sally and Dick Tyler, her boss at the Historical Commission, you remember what led up to that. We were told, talk about, Ella King-Torrey's deadline. We were told, apparently Dick Tyler said to Sally, the mayor wants to meet with people in the community who want this place preserved today. And this was 10 a.m. in the morning. And Sally calls me, and all we had were telephones. And she said, so we have a meeting with the mayor in his office, but I can't go because he doesn't want to hear from city employees. How are we going to do this? And you actually didn't question that. You said, we're going to do this. And it was a matter of being on the phone with everyone you could imagine to have a broad representation of neighborhoods, organizations, federal agencies, whatever we could find. And they showed up, and without any rehearsal, we were able to kick around the table why the redevelopment authority should be left alone, and this should be on a new course towards preservation and interpretation. And I could see the light go off, or rather on, in Mayor Good's eyes as he got it. And it was a matter of days, if not hours, after that he yanked the project from the redevelopment authority.
And there's some pictures in the slide deck, but what were some of the things that were being offered up as redevelopment options?
There's one of them right there.
A Middle Eastern bazaar. That was what they called it.
A grocery store.
Yeah, grocery store.
That's the grocery store.
Parking for 140 cars, but that was only half of what was needed. So the question, and then this is where the neighborhood was really split on it. Mm-hmm. Yes, there would be jobs created, but also it would create a lot more traffic.
This is the one that was moving forward, and the Historical Commission was pretty close to approving this, but they didn't. And John Street, who was a city council person at the time, later became mayor. This was his district, and he wasn't in favor of it. And so in Philadelphia, if a project in your district, if you don't like it, you can stop it. So he also had.
And that was apartments, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, John Street became an advocate for preservation, but was this the turning point?
Yes.
So, because he literally was in favor of preservation, which
Yes.
is rare.
Yes.
Yes, good. Good to know.
And you both kind of already talked about this, but what were some other responses from the local community, from the neighbors, as all of these decisions were being made to redevelop or to preserve?
I think the neighborhood was interested in. I think when they were interviewed by the city planning department, who held meetings, they liked the idea of the grocery store, but they also complained a lot about traffic. They were afraid that it would change the character of Fairmount Avenue. So they weren't really totally in favor of anything. And the other thing that I think is really important to say about the neighborhood was that very few of the neighbors had ever been inside. Very few Philadelphians had ever been inside.
And we knew that once you're inside, we have won you over, essentially. So we urged for there to be tours. They were hard hat tours. You had to sign a release. There were vast areas that were dangerous, that you would go, people would wander up to the top of the tower right above us, cell block 7, which had parts missing and trees growing out of the walls. It was, but the other aspect, if you couldn't get in, the next best thing was to see it through photographs. And there were days designated where photographers were, art and documentary photographers were given free rein. And that, as a result, this is before the internet, had a lot of, there was a calendar that was done, I forget, in the early period. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of photographs being shared where there hadn't been any, almost. And that resulted in a lot of interest and a lot of support. If not money and answers, it was a lot of interest.
So once all the support came through and the funding came through and the mayor got on board, Sally, can you talk about the preservation philosophy in the early days? How did you decide what to do first? And can you also roll in like your journey at Eastern State?
Sure. So I think it was once we finished the stabilization plan, which was to simply cover the roofs, cover the skylights. There are 1,100 skylights in this site, and they were all leaking. Most of all were leaking. The architect, Sam Harris, who had conducted this study, came to one of the task force meetings, and he said the cheapest way to deal with this building is as a stabilized ruin. And then we said, well, there's some places that might need restoration, so it became a stabilized ruin with selective restoration. So that was a philosophy that was very early on. And if you look at this room, for instance, there was plaster on the wall when we first came in. There was a ceiling, and over time, the plaster just kept falling off, and we just kept sweeping it up. And the question then becomes, do you replaster this room, or do you leave it the way it is because it reflects the period of time that the building's been deteriorating?
Talk a little bit about you and kind of how you got even more invested in this place.
Well, so quickly, so the task force became a committee of the Pennsylvania Prison Society, and I was chairing that little committee. And then we shot a movie here. Oh, then we hired. Tours opened in 1994, and in 1995 we hired our first permanent staff member, Sean Kelly, and then we shot a movie here.
Was that Tina Turner?
No, Tina Turner had made a video in here before we got involved. So the movie was Return to Paradise, and there was a $15,000 site rental fee, and that allowed me to come on as the executive director. So I was the second employee. And that was in 2000, and I retired in 2023. And my job was to stabilize this building with selective restoration, fundraising, also board of directors was very important. We became a 501c3 in 1993, maybe. I'm sorry, forgetting that date. But once we were our own nonprofit, we were able to raise money for ourselves and form a board of directors. So that was my job.
And it's still city property.
It's still city property.
How much is the lease?
$1.
Okay. Lauren, if I
Yeah,
can
go ahead,
take
Ken.
a step
Yeah.
back here. We mentioned the role of the press and the op-ed pieces and the editorials, and because it's now all digitized, I'm able to go and look, and I did, and it's like, okay, Tom Hine, who wrote for decades the surroundings column, the architecture critic of the city, he wrote 8 pieces about Eastern State over decades. There were multiple stories published in the Daily News and the Inquirer. I was able to easily, just by searching for Preservation Penitentiary, those 2 words, and you see them highlighted on some of the slides that I added to a good group that was already here. There were about a dozen, if not more, reporters who wrote about Eastern State at one time or another. So there was, I can't imagine there wasn't conversation on a regular basis at the Inquirer at Broad and Callow Hill, was it? And it really played a role because it kept the fate of this site and its potential impact in the foreground for years. And even when it was unresolved, it kept being. And so you have headlines like hard sell, C-E-L-L. People had a lot of fun.
I mean, a lot of the headlines are in the slide deck too if you're watching it. And I know you brought some of them with you, Ken.
Here's one that I think is in this. Good delivers prison reprieve. Group hopes to unlock history. The puns there's no end to them.
Well, and we continue to use that title. We have a series called Unlocking History. So a lot of it's really compelling, and I like that point that you're making, right? Like, how do you keep the public engaged in this? How do we keep the public engaged in deciding what to preserve, how we want to remember things? And I think that's really like the conversation that we're trying to call people into all the time here, because this place hooks you, is so powerful. There is no better place to contend with the way we use prisons today than in this building, right? So when you think about, coming here now in 2025, what do you feel most proud of? And what do you hope people are walking away with, right? You both said to me when you got here, wow, it's so busy today. So what do you hope people are feeling and thinking about when they go?
I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the public when it came to saving the building, because we had these hard hat tours and we had to limit how many people could come in, but we had waiting lists. People were stunned. They had never seen the inside, and so we were able to use those numbers to say, look, we're proving to you that people are very interested in this. And in the beginning, we were interested in the architecture. We were compelled by the architecture, and it wasn't until we opened up Cell Block 3 when the connection to what's happening in prisons today began. And then the big graph happened, and so by the time I left, I felt like the most important places, the most important roofs were preserved. Some wonderful places where you can feel what it might have been like to be here as a prisoner were preserved, and yet that powerful big graph out there jolts you when you see how many people we incarcerate in this country. And this is an amazing place to tell that story because it hits you just like walking through the building does. So that's very proud moment.
The idea that incarceration is an issue is very much out there, and we don't encounter it directly all the time. I imagined in my hopeful imagination way back when that this place might be the home to an institute for the study of the impact of incarceration. And it wasn't possible to initiate that, and I would share that hope with others at any point, but I realized it wasn't possible. But the rewriting and acceptance of the newer revised mission statement is that. And I'm not patting myself on the back, please don't, it was such an obvious next step that once the historical pieces were taken care of, then what? Mm-hmm. And it really started when the Art Museum had its opening of that exhibit and the catalog or the book that accompanied that, which you have.
I brought
Norman Johnston and Jeff Cohen and I wrote chapters, and it was an exhibition with borrowed objects from all over, and there it is from 1994. So in that,
still sold in the bookstore.
It sure is. Crucible of Good Intentions. When you come on board here to join the frontline staff, you get that book.
In that conference that accompanied the opening of the exhibition, we invited a producer from 60 Minutes who had done a documentary, a segment on Pelican Bay, a place where solitary confinement was still being used. And to have that not aired, but projected in the conference or in the public room at the Art Museum was really a first. I mean, that was not something that they had ever done before and would even do anytime soon after that. They were the Art Museum. They were not a social history kind of a place. And I remember that moment when Robert Montgomery Scott walked in and there was the projection of the incarcerated people in a conversation, and the head of the board or the head of the Art Museum walking into that scene. And it's like things are changing. People are thinking differently about this, and it's important.
So Ken, you kind of talked about this a little bit, but when you think about like your career in this field, what sets this project apart for you? Like what's brought you back today?
I never stopped wanting to feel that vibe that I felt by being on the street in front of a place that had no clear future, helping that, being part of the team, the village that helped make that happen. I can't think of anything else I've done except have a family that is that important. I as a curator, I was able to get gifts for the library company of graphics. There were a few acquisitions that come somewhat close, but this was the full package. The site, the story, everything else.
So I just have one more question for both of you, and then we'll turn it over to the audience to ask some questions. And this is for both of you to answer. So what advice do you have for future generations who will be stewards of this space?
Let the buildings speak to you. That's a very weird thing to say, but
it's a very Sally thing to say.
well, but I think so. In my coursework at when I was getting my degree in historic preservation, you were always supposed to start a project by fully understanding everything about it. You were supposed to know the history of a room. You're supposed to know the materials. Were they, what time period were the materials from? So you understand fully what you're doing before you ever lift a hammer or do something like that. So I think that that's already been, and also I think there was a philosophy of excellence here, and that continues. I think that people that work here are compelled by this building. They know the new discoveries that they make, like Erica, who's sitting in the audience, who's the archivist. You know, she, with her little, what are these things over here?
Her exhibit is called What Is It?
Yeah.
And she will be doing a game show after this panel concludes if people want to stay.
So anyway, I think that the stewards of the building will have had a good philosophy set, and it continues.
I think it's important to consider that this is a workshop that has elevated the profession of preservation in Philadelphia, but also beyond. And that really is the next level. And to say we took care of the building, we got it on the right track, well, you know, how about all those people who cut their teeth and learned what preservation was, not necessarily the easy way, and and I don't know who these people are because I haven't worked here, but you do, and you know where they are, making a difference in other places around the country and maybe beyond.
And there's one program starting this, which Liz is running, and it's a workforce development program here. It's teaching carpenters, masons, cement mixers how to work in a historic building. And these are skills that have been, people are aging out. And so this is a very important, also very important part of the future here.
Yeah, and I think it's really tied into our mission, right, of doing workforce development and being a place that's inclusive and raising awareness. And so we really are creating the next generation.